Pleased to say we are joined by an old friend and colleague of many years. His name is Peter Huessy. These days, he is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and president of Geostrategic Analysis. He has his finger on the pulse of, lots of issues in the policy arena in Washington, but most especially nuclear policy. And I'm anxious to catch up with him about two related topics. One, what Vladimir Putin is up to in this part of the battle space, if you will, and what are we up to in terms of deterring him? Peter Huessy, it's good
Yes.
to have you back. Welcome.
Thank you, Frank, very much. I appreciate your uh, having me on your show.
We're speaking to you on VE Day, the day that Vladimir Putin, I think, had in mind celebrating his conquest of Ukraine. That hasn't happened. The big parade did, but his comments apparently were relatively muted, other than making the case for invading Ukraine on the grounds that it was going to have nuclear weapons and was a terrible threat. Um, Talk to us a little bit, Peter, as you see it, as somebody who's really schooled in these subjects. What is Putin's doctrine with respect to nuclear warfighting and his capabilities to do it in a way that could be directly relevant to what his options might be in Ukraine and beyond?
Starting in 1997, when he was head of the National Security Council in Russia, he put together a new plan of what General Hyten calls escalate to win. And that was basically we're going to threaten the use of nuclear weapons in a limited way on a regional basis up front in a crisis so that if a conflict does break out and the Russians invade, as they've done Ukraine or Georgia, the United States will stand down and not fight.
Mhm.
And this was basically keep us out of the fight by threatening the use of nuclear weapons early, as opposed to we get into a conventional fight and someone says, I'm losing, and they decide to go nuclear because they want to escalate. And the thing is, again, as General Hyten, the former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has said, every time you do a workshop on that or tabletop exercise, it ends up in what he calls, Armageddon.
Mhm.
So that's what Putin developed, said he was going to develop, announced it, put together the things. And as our colleague Mark Schneider at the National Institute points out, they have anywhere between 2,000 and 5,000 regional theater weapons. The United States has a couple hundred of such bombs in England and other parts of Europe, which have to be dropped from a plane like gravity bomb, which
Mhm.
is considerably less than anything the Russians have
Yeah,
by a
both.
factor, probably a minimum factor of 10.
Yeah, both numerically, obviously, but also in terms of
Oh,
the
absolutely.
credibility of the deterrent, because those
Yes,
aircraft have got to actually get through air defenses to
that's
drop
true.
their ordnance
Yes.
and so on. Before we get to the U.S. part of this, Peter, just staying with the Russians, there has been uh, some discussion, at least, that what Putin might be inclined to do and might actually be preparing to do is to use nuclear weapons in a sort of demonstration in Ukraine to both stop the West from supplying
Hmm.
assistance to the Ukrainians and achieve, something approaching a victory, if not
Yes.
uh, literally, certainly one that he could claim is the basis upon which there can be some sort of settlement. Um, do you see that in the cards at this point, Peter? And if so, how high a probability do you assign to it?
Well, let me put it this way. Mr. Putin doesn't tell us what's on his mind in terms of what he will do. He has threatened. But if you look at the Russian statements, starting about 12, 15 years ago, the Russians made repeated statements at the strategic level saying, we're going to nuke you, America, if you get out of hand. And that would happen every year. Putin would make the thing, the chief of staff would make that, Lavrov would make it. And it was unnerving, but it was like, okay, maybe it's just bluff. In the last 2 years, we have seen an enormous increase in very detailed nuclear scenarios, like we're going to bury Britain under a waterfall of radioactive fallout,
Tidal wave.
a tidal wave
Yeah.
going from London up to Scotland. And then
Using
but
using
also,
an underwater drone they call the
yeah,
Poseidon, as I understand
right.
it, with a
On the other
huge
hand,
100 megaton warhead on it.
On the other hand, we have heard officials just in the last week, three in fact, say, oh no, we will not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
Mm.
So then the question is, and you pointed out, what's the objective? Does he want to take over the eastern part of the country and the Crimea? Using nuclear weapons to stop America and the allies, NATO, supplying weapons is like, well, where do you do this? What do you hit? Do you hit some part in Poland? Do you hit something in Romania? Do you actually use a weapon in Ukraine itself? I think that would be so horrific in terms of the world's reaction that I don't see that. What I see is if he decides he's going to try to take down Ukraine altogether again after securing the East and Crimea, then all bets are off on that. And so it's not 50% chance, but let me put it this way, Frank, it certainly isn't zero.
Yeah.
And the question is, you have to decide. Do you think he's bluffed? Now, this administration said
Talk,
we're not
talk.
going to go into Ukraine because we think his threat is serious.
Right.
So he thinks my threat worked.
So, Peter, in terms of the threat, it seems as though there has been an awful lot of other stuff that has been taking place at the
Hmm.
strategic level, as you say,
Right.
including flushing submarines from their ports.
Yes.
Not that that's necessary, given the long range on their missiles, but
Right.
it's an indication of a heightened uh, DEFCON, as they say,
Right.
defense condition on the Russian side. Their land based forces are ready to go at any moment,
Yes.
of course, without any forewarning. Bombers apparently are on a heightened alert as well. Um, do you credit all of that as evidence of a willingness to exercise those forces as Putin has done now with his simulations, at least,
Yes.
personally presiding over them now for some years against the homeland of the United States itself, or not?
Well, when you look at the Russian system, the way it's laid out, it can launch everything, pretty much everything, without warning.
Mm-hmm.
Without, we would have to put our subs to sea, put our bombers in the air. Now our ICBMs would remain the same. With Russia, the subs can launch right in port. The ICBMs that are immobile, they can just open the garage they're in, the roof, and launch. So they could launch upwards of 70 some odd percent of everything they have without telling us in advance by exercising and flushing them that we would be there. That is the way the Russian systems have always been designed. Ours are designed to retaliate if struck first.
Right.
Theirs are designed particularly to go first.
Mm-hmm. And that's
So
what's so worrying is if
that
this
is
is
what's worrying.
actually what they're prepared to do, as well as
Exactly.
have the capability to do. And Peter, it raises a question that I haven't heard much discussion of. I don't
Hmm.
live in the circles that you do, and you probably are very much aware of what's being thought about in this regard. Is there any discussion on the U.S. side in light of both those standing start capabilities that you described and steps that Putin has taken, including, it seems, heading to the Ural Mountains to get into a bunker himself for at least some of this
Hmm.
period,
Yes.
that our defense condition or DEFCON should be raised from the very low level at which it is normally set, which I gather is the case at the moment.
Well, we've taken some of our bombers and flown them to various parts of the world to signal that we're serious about this. We could put more submarines to sea. We could put up to 10 out of the 12 that are operational. We could put them to sea. I think the administration thinks that would be provocative. That's why they didn't do two Minuteman tests. On the other hand, the Russians said, well, we were fine testing and tested their Sarmat missile, which is the 10 warhead behemoth. So I don't think we will go, Frank, to a higher DEFCON level because I think overwhelmingly the administration, they think that that would be provocative. Now, what if the Russians visibly go higher level, put their bombers? I mean, they've been flying their bombers near Japan, near Hawaii, near Alaska, as you know, trying to push into our airspace and doing it very provocatively in ways that have not been done since the end of the Cold War. So it's not like the Russians are wallflowers when it comes to this.
Yeah, that box would seem to me to have been checked, honestly, and it does
Yes,
seem to me that
I hear
a
you.
higher DEFCON is in order here. Peter, let me just ask you, one of the things we've talked about in previous visits is efforts on the part of the Biden administration on the one hand, or congressional Democrats, or both, to not just refrain from elevating our status or our capabilities, but actually unilaterally reducing our nuclear forces. What's the latest on that as you see it? Quickly.
Well, they decided to keep the strategic systems as the program of record. 12 new submarines, 400 Minuteman, or now Sentinel missiles, and bombers, at least 100 of which 20 or so would be nuclear. They did cut the money, the research money for the Sea Launched Cruise Missile, and they cut the B 83 bunker buster bomb, which goes underground and gets the leadership positions. The leadership of our nuclear forces, Admiral Richard and our head of our forces in Europe, have both said, no, we really need that. And Mike Rogers, the ranking Republican on the House Armed Services Committee, said he said it will be back in the budget.
I hope from his lips to God's ears, as they say. Peter Huessy, we have to leave it at that. Thank you for your time today. Thanks for the work you do at the Hudson Institute. Come back to us with updates soon if you would. Next up, we'll talk with Brian Kennedy, the chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, about China, election integrity, and more. Straight ahead.